think I probably fell in love with the church long before I knew who Jesus was. A bit of a rewind. My mom had been through a couple divorces. Her first one was before I was born. And eventually we found ourselves living in Joplin, her a single mom, doing her best to raise 3 kids, honestly doing a good job. I think where things kind of took a turn for our family is she went to a bar one night, and she didn't do that often. But that night she met a guy named Dan McGrew who was just enamored with her. And in the process of Dan trying to court her, mind you, it's their first time to meet, their first night together, he makes a comment. He says, well, if we get married, we got to go to church. She's like, well, yeah. Well, fast forward, he realized we got to get these kids out of Joplin. We're shoplifting too much, getting away too much trouble. So he moves us all the way out north of, Oronogo, north of where the church is now, in the middle of nowhere where there's nothing to shoplift. And we're going to start over. In the process, I started actually going to church. I met a kid at school named Curtis. He took me to this little Baptist church in Oronogo. I didn't know what church was. I remember spending the night with his family, and they all sat around at dinner time. They held hands, and they all put their head down. I was like, what are they doing? I had never seen prayer before. But something was captivating about this family. And eventually my dad's like, you know what, we need the whole family to go to church. And he wanted to try out this little church we're in right now, Christ Church of Oronogo. I remember we loaded up in the vehicle. First time we pulled up the property, we all sat there, we're in the car, turns the car off, and he's like, we're not dressed for this. So we started the car back up, we left the parking lot, went home. Came another week, sat in the parking lot. I was like, well, we're late, so we started the car back up, went home. But eventually we walked in the door, and I remember somebody greeted us right there in the door. And they said, my dad reached his hand out. My name is Dan McGrew. Nice to have you and your family here. Where do you go to church at? Dan, he's like, well, I grew up going to Fairview Christian Church over in Carthage. Oh, yeah, Fairview. Hey, this is Brother Dan. He goes to Fairview. I'm like, no, Brother Dan doesn't go to Fairview. Brother Dan goes to the church of barbecue and keg parties. That's where Brother Dan goes to church. And that night we got invited over to a family for some ice cream, and what seemed like a really uneventful night really turned into something pretty transformational in my family. We lived out in the country, and still do, and back in those days you had to burn your trash in these 55-gallon drums, and I was burning trash that day, and an aerosol can blew up, and it caught the leaves on fire. Those leaves burned underneath my brother's 55 Chevy, caught it on fire. Eventually my mom saw the smoke, yelled at me. I ran out with a rake. I'm trying to put this fire out. I can't. It's spreading too fast. She runs out. We're getting a hose. We can't get this thing out. It's out of control. And the bad part is it's going to burn over, and it's going to catch all of my dad's storage buildings on fire. And it's going to eventually take everything out. And I knew if my dad lost those storage buildings, he would lose everything. We couldn't get it out. So finally, my mom had a great idea. She'll remember that my dad, where he's building the house, was right across from where Harry S. Truman Elementary is today. But back then, she had met a lady that lived just up the road, Vicki Earhart. And she met her at church. And so she jumped on the phone and she called Vicki and said, hey, Vicki, we got a problem. Our property's on fire. Can you go get Dan? And then she jumped in her car, went down and told Dan, hey, your property's on fire and your family needs you. He told his crew, hey, we got to shut it down. I've got to get home. And his guys they all left him. They loaded up their tools and they went to their homes. They knew what was going on. And my dad got down off the roof that day and was loading his tools up as fast as he could. You can't just leave your tools when that's your livelihood. And he finally jumped in his truck and was flying down D Highway, just going right in front of where the church is today. And driving down those old country roads, he eventually got to where we live. And tried to get into the driveway and he couldn't. There were cars. This gets me every time. There were cars all up that driveway. And he couldn't get in because Vicki had called the church, and then the church had called neighbors that attended this church from all around that area, and they had showed up. They brought their rakes, their shovels, and they jumped out of their cars, and I remember how fast they attacked that fire. By the time my dad got there, it was all out. My mom was just standing there stirring lemonade because on that day the church showed up and they put out the fire. And I realized, man, I came to love the church long before I knew who Jesus was. After that, for a family that was known for really cake parties and barbecue, I still remember my dad loading up every liquor bottle into this old orange wheelbarrow and went up to the chat piles in Oronogo, and I watched him break every bottle. And the church truly changed my life. That's why I love the church.